Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It is 45 past the hour. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever this finds you. It's really delightful to have you all with us. My name is Frances Brown. I'm with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I think we have a terrific panel for you today with three expert guests, Kate Bateman, Corinne Graff, and Lauren Kelly. I'll say more about their backgrounds in just a minute. But first, I want to just say a little bit of background on this panel. So today we are talking about learning lessons from Afghanistan and charting a path forward in other fragile states. The rationale here is that as debate continues on the Afghanistan experience and donors are rightly soul searching, there's also ongoing efforts to learn lessons more broadly in fragile states. We've had a couple remarkably candid assessments come out in recent months on both efforts in Afghanistan from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, SIGAR, and also from the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group, among others. These frank accounts are really laudable, in my view, but there's also a chance that higher level lessons will not be taken from them, and that these rather technical reports won't necessarily permeate into the policy world. So we're here to sort of unpack those findings and see what we can take forward from them. I would mention also that I think this entire PeaceCon is a really terrific effort with courtesy thanks to Alliance for Peacebuilding as well as USIP today. So I really commend them and thank them for bringing us all together. So in terms of our panelists today, we've got three expert panelists in alphabetical order. We have Kate Bateman, who's currently with the U.S. Institute of Peace. Kate comes from a long career, most recently at the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction on their Lessons Learned project. She also served in the U.S. State Department, as well as in other policy-related positions, as well as Capitol Hill. So she brings a tremendous amount of Afghanistan experience that we will be tapping into. Second, we've got Corinne Graff. Corinne Graff is also with USIP now, but also comes from a long career in the policy arena. Before leaving government at the end of the Obama administration, she served as a Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Africa Bureau. Prior to that, she served on the National Security Council staff as a director for democracy and development, where she was also my predecessor on that particular file, which was terrific. And prior to that, had worked at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, as well as the Brookings Institution. So Corinne brings a tremendous amount of expertise on the U.S. government's fragile states effort that we'll hear more about in this discussion. And then finally, in alphabetical order, we have Lauren Kelly, who's with the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. I'm really excited that we have Lauren today because she was the lead evaluator on this recent World Bank report on the World Bank's engagement in situations of conflict that covers 10 years ending in 2020. She's also got an extensive background in conflict management. She's worked on natural resources, conflict, pastoral and farmer relations in Africa. She's got a wide range of experience in her over 20 years in evaluation experience. So really excited to learn from all three of our panelists today. The final thing I want to say just at the start is that we hope this will be a conversation, and we are really eager to hear from all the terrific folks who are joining. And I see a lot of, it's in the names chart, I see both a lot of old friends and people whose work I know. So we're really hoping to elicit your comments and questions throughout. Unlike other panels where the panelists all talk for 90% of it and then we go for questions at the final 10%, we're really hoping to make this a conversation throughout. So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions to the three panelists, looking at recent reports and lessons learned. But then I really would like to open it up. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will get them and hopefully smoothly integrate them into our conversation. So with no further ado, to our conversation. And Lauren Kelly of the World Bank IEG, Independent Evaluation Group, I want to go to you first because this report that your team recently released is, to my mind, really seminal and really important. It also, for those who don't follow World Bank efforts all that closely, it also comes on the heels of a lot of extensive bank probing on issues of fragility, conflict, and violence. The bank did release an FCV, fragility, conflict, and violence strategy in recent years. So there's a lot of important thinking going on over there. So Lauren, maybe just give us the overview here. What does this report specifically look like? And anything new to emerge from your assessments? And what kind of recommendations would you highlight for our audience?
Thanks, Francis. And I love the idea of this being a conversation. So however you want to run that, that's great with me. And thanks for inviting me, and thanks for inviting us to present the takeaways from the Independent Evaluation Group's evaluation of the World Bank engagement in situations of conflict. This is an evaluation that spanned about a decade of our engagement in 22 different conflict-affected countries. So we are indeed hoping that lessons can emerge and be taken from this that can be applied to some of the toughest places, not the least of which is Afghanistan. Let me speak to the fact that the World Bank did put forward a new strategy on the way that they engage in fragile and conflict areas, and also the way we engage in violent situations. That was about a year ago. Our aim was to do a real-time evaluation to learn lessons from implementation. Okay, that could really help the strategy be put into action. While we were doing this in the World Bank itself undertook a review and revision of its own operational policies. And I want to speak to that for a minute, because I think that's really critical when we're talking about this topic across our institutions. A strategy is a strategy. Okay, it's a vision statement, it's a goal set for the institution. It gets everyone on board. However, what underlies these strategies is their own operational policies. They are the license to operate. And what's been critical in the bank is the revision also of our operational policy 2.30. And that is our conflict policy. And what that did was create space. Well, first of all, it restated our mandate. We're a development organization, but it gave us space. And this has a lot to do with the way that we move forward in situations like Afghanistan, to revisit our own role in things like the security sector, where we have very little competence, but that asks us to think about how we engage in places like Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, as a development agency, which requires another look at partnering. And I'll get to that. Okay. The World Bank also at the same time put in place through this revised policy new guidance on how to deal with non-state actors. These include armed actors. And again, this is an area where I think there's a lot of learning needed and where competence also needs to grow. Remember that for the World Bank, because of our mandate, we can engage in all these areas only under situations or in the situations where we are invited in. Okay, there's no political interference allowed. But still, if there's an invitation for the World Bank to engage and partner in these areas, these revised operational policies gives us more space to both operate in the security sector and to think about how we engage non-state actors. Think about the current situation with COVID. Think about delivering vaccines in areas that are not controlled by governments. How do we all do that? It's as simple as that. But you need the operational policies to enable staff to be able to work in these areas. So the reason I raise this is because the new strategy puts in place a clear framework for engagement. It talks about how we stay engaged, how we focus on the prevention of conflict, but the underlying policies that give staff the license to operate really deal with the risks that are attendant in our boards and our management structures, all right, that can limit our own engagement in these kind of environments. And I wanted to mention that because that's very key. The bank's also doing a couple other things before I get into my own findings. I'll just say that also a lot of work has been done to reclassify the nomenclature around fragility and conflict, and recognizing the heterogeneity of where we work. And so this allows us to think about, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan differently from countries like Nigeria. And while that may seem like just putting things on a different list, it actually then does give us a lot of space to think about how we engage differently in these countries that are fully affected by conflict. And lastly, I'd say, and this is more of a warning light than a finding, in terms of what the bank is doing, it has put its money where its mouth is. And all of the deputies that contribute to our own international development assistance funds have indeed helped us to top up our funds in many of these countries. We've gone from $2.7 billion about a decade ago, okay, in countries that are affected by conflict, to almost $8 billion today. That's an annual average of $8 billion going to conflict-affected areas. So another area that we shed a light on is the money's on the table. Now, how do we think about and analyze the effects of these large projects that are going into countries that have very limited absorptive capacity and where things are very fragile indeed. And so some of these issues really do need to be attended to as we move forward. I'll say 4 more points quickly, Francis, before I turn it back over to you. So given this context and all of these changes that are occurring in the World Bank and within the world, we put forward 4 key recommendations. And one of the recommendations we put forward is, given the increased reliance on assessments and diagnostics that need to be done, and that need to be done in real time, okay, particularly when we work in these situations and together, we cited a constraint related to the own client-facing nature of our own engagement at the World Bank. Because in order to do these diagnostics well, okay, we have to gather information and then be able to share them with the country operational teams that need that information and data to make operational decisions. But given the politically sensitive nature of much of this information, it is a challenge to fully transfer this information into our own country strategies and our own operations. And so we're really looking to help the bank think about mechanisms where you can gather all the information you need and also distribute that in ways that can be used while retaining confidentiality. This is clearly a challenge. Number 2, it's not doing business as usual by engaging locally groups that can help us do real-time conflict risk monitoring. And that is not something that the bank has always done, but something that it's done a lot of experimenting in recently. That's in Niger, that's in Myanmar, that's in Somalia, that's in countries where we need real-time information from the ground. But the trick there, I think, for us is really using this information that's identifying shifting perceptions of different groups and integrating that into decision-making in real time. And as I think you know, agencies like the World Bank, find it sometimes difficult to find those entry points and to shift portfolios, to shift operations, and particularly in real time. So we're asking for more entry points for that. The 2 last points I'd make are, and I think we'll get to this later too, but to think about the way when we do address the way that we need to think about the drivers of fragility and conflict in our country strategies and operations. Think about the difference between what we do technically, and that is doing technical operations that are sensitive to conflict, versus an operational portfolio writ large at the country level that addresses the drivers of conflict. And so it's thinking about the ways that we engage institutions within our policy dialogue, within our own policy and budget support. And then, I know we'll talk about this later, Francis, but then putting that front and center in terms of how you define that country platform and how you monitor aid. Big recommendations, I'll leave it at that. And back to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And a theme running through your remarks that I think we will return to a lot this morning is no more business as usual and rethinking some of our familiar modes of doing work. So I look forward to circling back on that with you and our other panelists. So Kate, let's zoom in a bit on Afghanistan. Surely if there is a time for soul searching among the international donor community on our efforts, I think it is now on Afghanistan. And there's a lot of work that you have done both at SIGAR, now at USIP, that I think really sheds important light on this. We've also already gotten a really meaty question from Monty McMurtry that you all see in the chat, looking at questions of short-term efforts in Afghanistan and the big picture. We can circle back in more detail to that, but just to say, I think Afghanistan is really on our mind. And so as you hear Lauren's recommendations from her work and looking in general at World Bank operations in conflict situations, what resonates for you in terms of the US government experience in Afghanistan? What do you think is applicable? And as we think about the collapse of the Islamic Republic that occurred in August, what do you think we should be taking away? What's important to be thinking about? Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Francis and Lauren, for those great starting comments already. I would like to zoom out and keep it kind of at a macro level on Afghanistan, because I think that's where our minds are right now. But I'd like to speak to two of the World Bank report recommendations. One is that on managing and producing politically sensitive analysis. For the U.S. government, different agencies have various channels to report, disseminate, and store that kind of information, of course, including the intelligence community. And I would assume that all of these systems amount to, something more robust than perhaps the World Bank's systems. However, I think what's most interesting about that recommendation, and that it's first, is just the importance of understanding the political environment in which we're working, and the kind of far-reaching effects, the political effects of our own actions. So that one particularly resonates with me in terms of Afghanistan, because looking back now with the benefit of hindsight and seeing how actually, though we always knew that the gains that were made, the economic, political, and social gains in Afghanistan were fragile, we didn't truly understand actually the extent of that fragility. And so I want to look back to 2001 in the immediate intervention made after 9/11. The U.S. chose not to just track down and kill or detain the perpetrators of 9/11, but to remove the Taliban regime, to effect political transformation on a national scale. And after the trauma of 9/11, there seems to have been just strikingly little deliberation about that political decision or consideration of its consequences. And we went further than ousting the regime. We established a new political order that excluded the Taliban, that included many abusive and predatory figures. And all of those factors, together with the hunting down and killing the Taliban, or those who we were told were the Taliban, sometimes inaccurately, all of that fueled an insurgency that then emerged in force just 3-4 years later. And of course, the whole state building project was then a different thing when it is happening in the midst of conflict, in the midst of an insurgency. So that, this might be cliche for Afghanistan watchers, but I just want to emphasize that political decision. And it's easy to criticize those decisions with the benefit of hindsight, and we could have a whole other debate on the good arguments the good arguments for taking those policy decisions that we did. But nevertheless, those key early policy decisions reflected a real naivete about the political consequences of our actions. And that's a huge lesson we should take from the US experience in Afghanistan. I want to briefly mention kind of other examples where along the way we really failed to understand the politics or political economy. There are many examples in the governance and anti-corruption space, and we've often tried to impose a technical solution when the problem was fundamentally political. And your work on subnational governance efforts really highlights this, that programs repeatedly sought to essentially teach Afghan citizens and government officials how to talk to one another, while missing the fact that the problem wasn't communication channels. It was underlying politics and incentive structures, that citizens didn't want Kabul authorities, whom they saw as extortionists, interfere in local matters, and the state had an interest in avoiding a periphery that wanted more authority and resources. And then I'd like to shift to just how do we address this? Because this is all very difficult. Understanding the politics of another country sufficiently enough to effectively engage in it in the midst of conflict is very hard. And so again, it may seem simplistic, but I think that the IEG report rec highlights that we actually have to cultivate a culture of humility by admitting and embracing what we don't know. And then that kind of culture could perhaps have positive knock-on effects for policy. It might mean we have less confidence and attachment to what we think we're doing right. And then we are more likely to question and re-examine what we're doing along the way, rather than getting stuck in these trajectories where deeply held assumptions drive policy decisions. That kind of humility might also encourage us to acknowledge the importance of what our in-country partners know, to privilege information and analysis from them, and to build long-term relationships on the ground with our partners. And then I'd like to speak to one other rec more briefly in the IAG report, which is on rethinking what success looks like. And I think that rec ties very well to the lessons in the most recent Cigar Lessons Learned report that came out in August. I'll provide that link for you all to put in the chat. For instance, that report found, had some key lessons on timelines, sustainability, and monitoring and evaluation. On timelines, many programs were too short term. There should have been, what success looks like should have been driven by longer term objectives and consistency. And a tangible example of that is for instance, alternative development projects to try to help farmers shift away from poppy cultivation. The most profitable alternatives to poppy are high value perennials, vineyards, and orchards, but those take 4 to 5 years to reach their full production potential. And most USAID projects in that space were an average of 3.5 years long. We were just not sticking with the farmers long enough to really enable a transition away from poppy. And then another example connects to sustainability. You can find many, on the programmatic level, the Cigar report found that an emphasis on sustainability was there in our policies, including Defense Department policies for projects as early as 2009. And yet in practice, these requirements were often just not met in implementation. And one reason was that there was a political and therefore bureaucratic pressure to show progress on a faster timeline. And that pressure outweighed the incentives for building in sustainability. And then my final point is on the meaning of that for, looking now at the collapse of the Afghan state and the security forces. Those are the economy and the security forces are two realms in which our failure to focus and prioritize sustainability are profound. We're profound and have these profound implications. We built up the donor community, including the US, but many other actors built up an economy in which 40% of GDP depended on foreign aid, and in which 75 to 80% of the government's budget was made up of foreign aid. And when that foreign aid was stripped away, and as of August, because of the Taliban takeover, it just catalyzed this economic crisis that is having profound humanitarian consequences. So there's that question of, we should not seek to establish or fuel an economy that is so dependent on foreign aid, and we should also seek to establish or build security forces that are not dependent on, for instance, the operation and maintenance support of 16,000 contractors who are suddenly pulled from the country. So the effects of those decisions were really far-reaching. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Kate. You've painted a really sobering picture of what I think we all agree is an important case that we really need to be grappling with. Hearing both your remarks and Lauren's, I was struck by the thought that we have gotten on board as a community, it seems to me, with a thinking and working politically agenda in terms of ideas. But in practice, we have so far to go. Clearly, we would like to implement this, but clearly, as both of your work shows, a lot remains to be done. So another point, Kate, that you made really resonated with me, and I think ties into some of Corinne's work as well. And that is this tension between short-term programmatic, short-term indicators of success, and what it takes in the long term to really cultivate peace, mitigate fragility. Here in the United States, in the policy arena here, as many of our viewers know, the Global Fragility Act legislation, which was passed in late 2019, aims to tackle some of those issues of looking in the long term. It also tries to embrace this theme that's coming out already about no more business as usual, really rethinking the way the US government engages in fragile states. So Corinne, you have been working this from the beginning and tracking it now closely as well. So I want to turn to you and ask your thoughts about to what extent these lessons and findings that we're hearing can be applied in the Global Fragility Act, the GFA, and from what you're hearing, sort of what are you watching and what do you think is important to keep in mind as we talk about the Global Fragility Act? Over to you.
Thanks, Frances. And let me first say I'm thrilled that we're having this panel discussion. I think it's a really important conversation to have about the assessments that different donors are carrying out. And not only because we have these evaluations, but because on the US side, we have the Global Fragility Act, which could really be a vehicle for the US government to carry forward recommendations like the ones that we're talking about today. So the GFA, I think, is very closely tied to the US experience in Afghanistan. I think it's not a coincidence that it was signed into law just 3 months before the peace agreement with the Taliban in early 2020 and the US decision to draw down. So to answer your question, Frances, I think, yes, the lessons from Afghanistan and many of the lessons that are highlighted in the World Bank IAG report are being taken into account because I think they're already at the center of the new law. So that's, four in particular, to my mind. The first being the Global Fragility Act's 10-year timeframe for U.S. country plans in fragile states. And in the last CGAR report that Kate mentioned, over and over again, we see that we in Afghanistan underestimated the time that we needed to achieve our policy objectives on various fronts and our stabilization goals in Afghanistan. And I think that's true in nations racked by decades of conflict like Afghanistan. And it's also true in countries where, instability may be just beginning to rise, like we see right now in coastal West Africa, that you need these longer time horizons. So I think that's key. I think a second issue that's key, that's also in the GFA, is the need for whole of government plans. You can't have a military strategy over here on one side and then a health strategy on the other, and an education plan over there, and no coordination between them. So this is definitely a hard lesson that we learned from Afghanistan, and I think one that's really at the heart of the GFA and that Congress really chose to highlight in the Global Fragility Act. Third, and I think especially on the U.S. civilian side, we haven't talked about this yet a lot, but the need to have the human capital to carry out stabilization, peace building in these countries, the trained personnel who understand conflict dynamics and the special development needs of fragile states, and who can design programs accordingly and lead the diplomacy accordingly. And I think that's something that's front and center in the CGAR report. And I believe is also being discussed at the World Bank, although maybe Lauren can say more about that. But I think an important aspect of the GFA is for the State Department and USAID to come back to Congress in the coming years after having done a policy review that outlines what are the staffing needs for these organizations in this regard. So I think that's key. For me, though, the most important lesson that's captured in the GFA, and it sounds to me like there's violent agreement on this panel, so it's not going to be very provocative or interesting, but is the need for evidence-based policy to understand the political dynamics, the power dynamics, the patronage networks that are an inherent feature of war economies, of fragile states as well, and to take those into account, take that conflict analysis into account when we're developing our programs, leading our peace processes and negotiations. And the fact is, as the CGAR points out in many places, the last CGAR report, but I think over the years, this has been pointed out, that the chances of our interventions backfiring are high when we're not taking those dynamics into consideration. So that's what I would highlight. I'm talking right now about what's in the law. Of course, the $1 million question is what's going to get implemented, but I think that's a separate issue. So maybe we can get into that later if we have time.
That is the $1 million question we await with bated breath here within the GFA supporter community on the outside. So thanks, Karine. I think that gives us a really useful overview. And I actually just want to follow up with you right away on the question of evidence-based policy, which I think we will be in violent agreement, as you say, on that, the need for it here. If we were to actually implement evidence-based policy, what, you've spent a lot of time in government and various perches. What do you see that change looking like in practice? And I think it probably relates to your issue of human capital as well, but I'd love to hear a bit more on that.
Sure, absolutely. So I think, one of the concerns I have, to be completely candid about this, is that with implementation of the GFA, I've often heard our USG colleagues say, in order to improve our performance in fragile states, it's really not about having the right strategy or having the right plan or having the right analysis. It's more about what we're able to do on the ground and what we're doing on the ground, and do our missions have what they need, which I think is clearly true to some extent. But I'm a little concerned that if we take that approach, that we're not going to fully absorb and recognize the need to do the conflict analysis piece better. I think we have eyes on the ground. Of course, there's obviously variation across missions in terms of how we do the conflict analysis, and to some degree across agencies. But I'm worried when I look at what the Europeans are doing, when I look at, what the World Bank is acknowledging. I was really struck by the fact that the evaluation group report was so candid about the need for the World Bank to do these really robust analyses that look at the politics. And obviously, that's a very difficult thing for the World Bank to do. It should be easier for the US government to do, but I worry that we're not taking on board the fact that we actually need to focus on that. So I think, so that's why I think for me, the first step is, let's look at what we're doing on the conflict analysis side. Let's look at what others are doing. Let's look at what the innovations are in this regard. And let's look at what we do in the area of global health and in the area of agriculture, where we, evidence-based policy is what we do best. And frankly, we're on the cutting edge in those sectors. So let's look at what we're doing in those sectors and see to what extent can we apply it also on the conflict side. And I realize it's harder, it's less quantitative, it's more perceptions-based, but I'm confident that we can do better. I also think a second issue, so in addition to, really pushing ourselves to do more evidence-based analysis and to make sure that we're accessing the evidence, is, let's also make sure that we're doing this in a way that's realistic, that is adaptive, in fluid environments, that is, to the extent that it can be done on the ground in the countries themselves. I saw there's a really interesting project going on at Graduate Institute Geneva. I believe it's tied up with the UN and what UN OCHA is doing on the humanitarian side, and looking at to what extent can they take into consideration conflict dynamics better when they're doing humanitarian assistance. But they're looking at ways of doing that conflict analysis on the ground in an iterative way, in real time, as I think Kate was talking about. And so let's look at what tools are out there, and the extent to which we can kind of decentralize the analysis and do it on the ground in the countries, I think is really important as well. But to me, I'm just going to highlight those two things because I think that's critical. And I worry a little bit that we're going to focus on the other huge things like interagency coordination, which obviously is something we need to work on. But we're going to overlook the kind of first steps and the really what I think is more low-hanging fruit.
Such an important point. Thank you, Karine. And that's really useful. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that I think the World Bank does have a lot to teach us on this. I was thinking about when it comes to analysis and impact evaluations, how the World Bank's National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan, that would be familiar to many, had a very robust impact evaluation that I think we learned a lot from. So Lauren, putting that out there if you want to talk to it at some later point in our panel, but just there is, as you say, Karine, there's a lot to go on from other donors. So I think this leads really nicely into the next topic I want to talk about, which is about monitoring, evaluation, and are higher order outcomes achievable? So one theme that we're hearing come out already is that from a lot of donors' perspectives, at the programmatic level, we seem to be doing good work. Things are going pretty well according to our metrics. And yet somehow when we look at the aggregate level in a country, where our work doesn't necessarily add up to the sum of its parts in all places. Programs might be deemed effective on their own terms, but there's a chance that they're not achieving the strategic progress that we're all seeking. So, Lauren, I'd love to turn to you first on this question. Thinking about this from the World Bank's perspective, based on the independent evaluation group's findings, what needs to change for donors to engage more strategically in fragile environments? Is it realistic even to think that donors can have impact on the aggregate level? And clearly the host country and the host government have a huge role here as well. So love your thoughts on that.
I think it does build nicely off of Kareen's comments and your questions to her. And before I move on to just M&E, I want to say something also about evidence-based policymaking that then links to that M&E. And that is that I think the evidence shows that when you have real-time analysis that really feeds into decision-making at a country level, that the decisions we take about sequencing and prioritization, when to do what, the decisions we take not to do something, okay, are just as important as what we should do. And that is very hard for institutions like ours, for example, that have a pipeline of programs that are ready to go, that are built, and that are agreed upon. Two other things that happen in these situations using evidence-based policy is we may say, we suspend our budget support. We suspend the budget support right now. We move into project financing quickly to do no harm during a very fragile transition, okay? Even ex ante of that. That in itself could produce results that we're not necessarily monitoring well, but there's an assumption there that if we move from budget support, we go into project financing and we take that subnationally, that we're reducing harm. And that do no harm angle is very critical when we think about portfolios of aid that are as massive as they are in some of these countries. And then we take a very strong decision to move backwards, to stop the financing, to suspend, et cetera, and so forth. And I think that is an area of research that I think would really engender a lot of learning, because that is a strong decision for a country team to take, to stop something, maybe even stronger than to do. The staying, and I'll get to M&E in just one second, but the staying engaged also involves taking risks. When evidence shows that staying engaged results in a certain number of lives saved, and when we use that evidence to say, okay, we're going to take risks that we're not normally take to save those lives, just like the humanitarian community does, okay, then we can actually affect outcomes on a large scale. The problem is sometimes we default back into areas of risk aversion, because when challenges do arise, even in these fragile situations, as much as we were bold enough to engage, we pull back. And that pulling back actually has a huge signaling effect on other donors' decisions, especially when we're providing a lot of the aid, and also whether or not countries can be bold enough to continue reforms if an agency like ours pulls back. So staying engaged, not pulling back, engaging in risk-taking, and staying the course even when challenges arise, sometimes that's just really key. And those are two large swathy answers to your question, and I'll answer it in a third way, which is more M&E. But I just wanted to put that out there first. We've said in our evaluation report that the worst you can do in a country program framework is think that you can evaluate a country outcome based on the sum of its parts. These country programs historically have added up project activities and outcomes and said, okay, we did really well. Okay, we built the road, we built the schools, et cetera. That's not where we need to go. We have 14 countries in transition right now that we're dealing with very differently. We have 22 countries that are affected by conflict that all need a different paradigm when it comes to building a country program. So what we're learning from our low-income countries, where we've done a lot of innovation, is that we have two parallel tracks that happen in these countries. One is your traditional country programming, your framework, all of the development programs that are ongoing, a sort of tallying. Another is a very candid conversation around their transitional strategies. And that candid conversation is a conversation we have together with our partners in a room that put together an action plan around those transition stages. And those mile markers mark where we're going in terms of things like elections, in terms of things we want to see happen vis-a-vis the peace settlement, that peace agreement, the kind of mile markers we all expect to see. And then tie our policy dialogue to those mile markers. And by putting that kind of conversation front and center ahead of the operational programming, the projects, the activities, then you can always feed your programs and projects and activities and how they're doing into the conversation. But if that country is not radically going in that right direction, then all of that operational analysis is not going to matter. And that really then helps you to tie ex ante a lot of your decision making at a country program level to your risk and resilience analyses, your analysis that say, this is why this program really matters. This is why road building is going to enhance the social contract. So you're making a case for those development interventions very differently. There's development gains, but it also ties very squarely into the transitional gains that we want to see made vis-a-vis that country's own peace agreement or peace settlement that they've, and then all the donors have to be a part of that. And that's the last thing I'd say is that if, with country outcomes at that level, that has to be a dialogue between donors and our different agencies. And all the activities that we're engaged in terms of monitoring that has to, and that's the CGAR report, that if we're all counting beans. Now, with that said, I'll say one last thing. I think that the bank will acknowledge that the last 20 years of Afghanistan have produced good results. And all of the work that we've done on health and education and all of those outcomes are real. And to the CGAR's point, I don't think the CGAR report said that those weren't very good results. It's just that the sustainability of those results, right, are highly in question because they cannot be sustained. And my last point would be then, it's that twin dialogue, that you're not abandoning that kind of conversation on operational results and making sure you have really good, technically feasible operations in conflict-affected areas that may require exceptional implementation procedures. And that's what we talked about in Afghanistan, third-party monitoring, accountability, transparency, for little c, for the corruption that takes place at the project level. And that we did pretty well, but it's that higher order goal. And so we need to tie those two things together. Thanks, Frances.
Thank you, Lauren. A lot there. And I can see already that some of these dilemmas on how the little picture adds up to the big picture are really coming to a head on Afghanistan. I see a couple of our participants in the chat eager to hear more on dilemmas of Afghanistan today. We will get there as well. I think it ties into this conversation. So Dr. Mia Bloom, Doug Brooks, we see you. We're getting there. But I wanted to circle back to Kate on some of these issues that Lauren raised on monitoring evaluation, and also bring in a question from Kelsey Coolidge that I think gets right at this, which is, what role can monitoring and evaluation play if policy or project assumptions are flawed? So Kate, what are your reflections on the Afghanistan experience on this dilemma?
Yeah, thank you, Frances. I'm going to try to circle back to Kelsey's question more specifically at the end, but I wanted to especially pick up on Lauren's comment that about needing to take on a certain level of risk and not have a risk aversion mindset, but have a risk management mindset, and that relates very much directly to the situation right now in Afghanistan. So we're going to talk about that later, and I will. I think that's just important to keep in mind and stress for this moment of a de facto government on the ground that is not formally recognized. But more broadly, I think Lauren spoke so well to the issues here, but I think I'm going to just speak from my experience on the CIGAR Gender Equality Report, our review of U.S. efforts to support women and girls. And what we tried to do was we tried to kind of compile the universe of gender-related programs, and we found more than 100 that were specifically, had objectives specifically and primarily targeted to support women and girls. And then we looked at a subset of those, about a quarter of them, 24 of them, looked at their evaluations and tried to identify how well did these connect to the national level outcomes and trends we were seeing. And we found, in many cases, echoing the World Bank report again, the measures, the metrics were overly quantitative, not qualitative enough. For instance, capturing numbers of trainings held, but not the outcomes of those trainings or beneficiaries' ability to put what they gained and learned in the trainings into practice in their daily lives. We also saw very overly broad program objectives, which were then made it very hard to identify any causal impact, or it made it hard to kind of draw the causal chain, to identify the causal chain between the program inputs and the outcomes that we sought to find. I want to tell briefly a story about maternal mortality ratios. There was a trend, maternal mortality ratios in Afghanistan are among the worst in the world, and there was attention very early on to address that in the health sector, and there were successes there. But then the data on the trend lines for maternal mortality showed improvement. However, after about 9 to 10 years, after about a decade, there was a problematic survey done that indicated much more success, more improvement than there actually was on the ground. It was later found to be the methodology was very flawed. But that result coming out, we heard reports from several people that the outcome of, the finding that maternal mortality ratios were declining kind of put a damper on donors' willingness to invest in that sector and to invest in maternal health care. And actually that figure was found to be really flawed. And so that was a case where we saw these national level outcomes. The data turned out to be inaccurate, and it affected, interventions on the ground that might have, it reduced efforts that might have actually saved more women and children's lives. I think it's also just worth noting that we might see a national level, we might see end-line data, if we're lucky enough to have the baseline data, we might see outcomes that we cannot always tie to program interventions. We can see an observed gain, for instance, in women's status or living conditions. And what Afghan women repeatedly emphasized to us was that, yes, many of your programs were, we can see positive effects, but it was the presence of the international community. It was the pressure that you put on for women's participation in government and visibility in the public realm. These were the real drivers of change and support for women, women civil society actors. So I think there are just so many intangibles. It's very difficult to sometimes put this all together. But at the end of the day, what we can do is try to draw correlations between our investments and the overall trend lines that are happening in country. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you, Kate. Corinne, do you have anything to add to this? I know you've hit a bit on monitoring evaluation already, so only if you want to weigh in.
No, I'm happy to skip a turn and go to the next question if you'd like.
Okay, all right. So I think this is actually getting at a really meaty issue, which is we realize we've had a lot of lessons learned, and that somehow the programmatic good news stories don't add up to the overall strategic question. I want to now drill down on the situation in Afghanistan, because it is somewhere where this is really starkly illustrated right now. So for those who are not following Afghanistan closely, it is in a catastrophe right now. That is a humanitarian catastrophe, widespread food insecurity bordering on famine, which even in Afghanistan's really conflict-racked previous decades was not something we saw, widespread famine. In addition, there are huge economic issues which are related, and real other challenges from human rights perspective. Dr. Mia Bloom brought up the very real issue of gender-based violence. And so right now, I think the donor community has some big questions to be asking itself on how it engages in Afghanistan. There is a huge need for assistance. At the same time, there is an understandable imperative not to legitimate the Taliban government. So these are really thorny questions, and I do not propose that our brilliant panelists are going to solve them all, but I would like to turn first to Kate to talk about this as regards U.S. government. What ideas you have potentially on threading some of these needles and engaging with Afghanistan without legitimating the government.
Thanks, Frances. It's a huge topic, so I'll try to be brief. But I think the enormity of the humanitarian crisis cannot be understated. It's not getting the attention it deserves in media. The audience will be more familiar than most, but millions are literally on the brink of famine, including at least 1 million children. I've already seen acute malnutrition. There were pre-existing problems that were made worse by the complete withdrawal of foreign aid, and so the economy is in free fall. So without expanding more on that, we also need to be able to kind of hold many truths in coexist. Many truths coexist here, and it's and I think our Afghans we heard from, we talked to in the diaspora and on the ground, emphasize that yes, the humanitarian situation is dire, calls for immediate response, but the Taliban is also an oppressive, brutal regime. It still is. And we have to hold them accountable for taking responsibility for the situation as well. The crisis is partly engendered by failures of the international community and the former Afghan government. And how do we, responding to all this is not easy. It's very complex. Now, what has already happened is that the U.S. Treasury has issued some exemptions on the sanctions, as well as UN Security Council. So we have some essentially easing of sanctions. We would not want to. We haven't really changed the underlying sanctions regimes, but we have allowed some easing for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, for personal remittances, and for humanitarian plus kind of basic goods, basic human needs for the Afghan people. But as I want to emphasize, my colleague Bill Bird is an economist at USIP, and he has laid out there are many more steps we could take to ease the crisis and inject more cash liquidity into the Afghan economy. He's laid these out in a report I will put in the chat shortly. Foreign banks also should not hinder the delivery of assistance and essential goods. And they need, in order to, they're very risk averse, and they need more assurance from US Treasury and the US government that they won't be hit with penalties when they do that. So in some cases, the steps already taken by Treasury are just not enough. But on the other hand, the international community cannot just be responding to this in terms of humanitarian aid, because the underlying problem is about an economy in free fall. So we need to get to some minimally functioning economy. So there are broader economic measures that are being discussed. That might include expanding the sanctions relief to encompass more private businesses. That might also include looking at the 900 million of Afghanistan's foreign exchange reserves. Some of those reserves correspond to Afghan banks' own foreign currency reserves with the Afghan central bank. So we need to try to make sure that those private banks can access their own reserves, that those are not, that those should not be frozen because they don't actually belong to the Afghan government. And finally, the Taliban need to play their part, of course. I want to bring up an issue that's more recently come to light. There are reports that the Taliban has been earning significant revenue, particularly in customs, and they appear to have enough revenue to pay the civil service, the entire civil service. And so as donors are contemplating, there have been discussions about how to pay for teachers' salaries and for health workers. But if at the same time the Taliban actually have the revenues to be able to pay the civil service, then we don't want the donor community to step in and simply enable the Taliban to use those expenditures for something else. For instance, security forces, secret prisons, and so on. So it's a very difficult situation to figure out how to hold them account, and yet not punish the Afghan people. So I'll sum up with a few steps. We can ensure the humanitarian aid continues to flow, that women are part of the design and delivery of that, and that monitoring is taking place to ensure that aid isn't diverted by the Taliban government. We can take steps to get the economy functioning and increase cash liquidity, put pressure on the Taliban to use government revenues for civil servants' salaries and basic service delivery. We need to monitor human rights violations. We can look for ways to impose more individual sanctions on Taliban leaders. And finally, I think there is some degree of consensus that we need to continue to engage the Taliban, for instance, at the recent meetings in Oslo, Norway, engage them without recognizing them. And I will stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. No easy answers here. Lauren, I want to turn it to you to reflect from the World Bank side. What are the questions you're asking on this? What are things you're watching?
So I'll speak in my own personal capacity as an evaluator here, and I won't speak for the World Bank. And I think that to build on Kate's last statement, that is the crux of the matter, engaging without recognizing. And I think that's where the debate really lies, particularly in the capitals. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road when you think about what kind of engagement strategy for institutions like the World Bank when the government's not recognized. That is a loaded statement, Kate. And so just to say, we could have a whole conversation on that, particularly with our own operational policies and also relationships. 3 things I want to say about moving forward from a development perspective, which is that, as you know, in December, the World Bank provided or released $280 million to UNICEF and World Food Program. That is clear, and the humanitarian need is clear. I think there's a figure of $4.4 billion that the United Nations put on the table that's needed immediately in Afghanistan. And there's a public petition that was put out. And I just want to say, between, in the last 2 to 3 months being inside the World Bank, you have felt there's enormous pressure from the humanitarian aid agencies for these funds to be released. And so I think the debate is rife. I also understand we're not going to come at the World Bank will not say something necessarily on this, maybe for a few more weeks. So I don't want to preempt any of that. But I will say some ideas that come out of our work from fragile and complex states more broadly that really can affect this conversation. One is that on top of the humanitarian aid that we've given to World Food Program and UNICEF, right, are the development humanitarian nexus. And those are the areas where the World Bank is trying to understand how to adapt some of its approaches to these kind of contexts. Take social safety nets, for example. That's an area where we're having broad discussions, not just in Afghanistan, but in many conflict-affected countries, about engaging at the household level and the importance of operating at a very local level, a village level, a sub-regional level. That has a lot to do with what Kate mentioned in terms of tracking or tracing, the deployment of aid, but it also has a lot to do with why we're doing it. And there, I think the conversation, and particularly from an evaluative lens, has to ask, what are the goalposts for development agencies when they're using social safety nets in conflict-affected situations? It is not just a transfer of cash. The money will be small per household. And so it might get you slightly through the winter, but it has to add up to more than that. And so the conversation around this kind of an adaptive approach that builds on the humanitarian aid structure could be more about what are the benefits of engaging locally at the household level from the point of view of retaining connectivity, digital connectivity, ICT inside of a household, awareness raising, et cetera, so that you're not disengaged completely from the average Afghan citizen. And so how can aid agencies think about that? Clearly, there's a difference between talking about aiding the situation nationally and working at the household level. And that's, I think, where we're talking right now. I'm going to leave all of the issues around ring fencing, money, and the situation with the banks alone right now, because I'm not in a position to talk about that. Clearly, that's the mechanisms that are being discussed right now in terms of how to ring fence that aid. But from a development perspective and those solutions, the second thing I'd say is, even so, with the funds we've given to WFP and UNICEF, it has engendered a debate around the moral debate around education and girls. And there is no clear answer to this. I mean, the real dilemma is, do you provide funds to sectors like education if girls won't be educated? And I don't think we can move forward as a development community until we're willing to wrestle with some of those moral dilemmas. And I think that's where you'll see some frozen aspects of aid right now, because those are the areas we're talking about. We're talking about basic services, health, education, right? We're talking about basic livelihood effects. So, and if you're not willing to talk about half the population, then I think that you do have a dilemma in terms of the way that we advance. In addition to that, I will say one last thing, and these are lessons from NSP, and I think we need a full unpacking of the National Solidarity Program and the 20 years of engagement across 4 phases and everything we can take from that. Because I think that everyone that was working at this level with the community development councils and engendering democratic processes and inclusion at that level needs to come out and talk about what happened on the ground in the last 5 to 7 years when the Taliban was encroaching, when parts of the periphery were becoming more conservative and we're dealing with a lot of these issues. You know, we're talking about August 17th. What about the 2 to 3 years before that, where a lot of the regions and our projects were being affected differently? The National Solidarity Program had a conflict area strategy. It had a way of working in conflict-affected areas, dealing with moderate Taliban issues. And so I feel like we're having a binary conversation as if Afghanistan wasn't experiencing some of these dilemmas prior to August 17th, and then all of a sudden we have to do aid so differently. I'm not belittling the crisis, but I am saying that we need a lot more experts that have worked on the ground. NSP had 17 different facilitating agencies, including Aga Khan. So we need to hear from those people that were on the ground to talk about that sort of the muddling through and the kind of compromises and decisions we had to make throughout the last few years to deliver aid. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Francis.
Thanks, Lauren. No argument from me on unpacking the lessons from NSP. And I'd also add Citizens Charter, the follow-on program. I think there's a ton to be learned. But now I want to actually broaden this aperture a little bit more widely as we think about charting a pathway forward. So Kate and Lauren have really spelled out the dilemmas facing international donors looking ahead on Afghanistan. Karine, I want to turn to you to sort of think first about more broadly donor engagement on fragile states. What are the steps you would like to see international donors to start to take immediately to improve their interventions? And how optimistic you are on, on our collective ability to actually take those steps. And then finally, Karine, I'll note we got a good question from Raju Bhatt just on when Global Fragility Act countries will be selected. Raju, I would note it's actually the executive branch who does the selecting, and then Congress, I think, sort of blesses rather than Congress selecting. But Karine, anything you want to share on that? There's a rapt audience.
Sure. Thanks, Francis. So just quickly to foot stomp on what Lauren said about the National Solidarity Program. I mean, I think that's critical to take the lessons from that and carry them forward in Afghanistan. But frankly, it's critical globally. I mean, it's a program that has so much to offer. And I think those of us who are, on this call, who are focused on this, know that, and we know the program quite well. But I'm struck by how many people don't know it, who are working on other parts of the world and frankly should know it. So I just want to foot stomp on that. Again, violent agreement in this panel on that. So to take the question about the timing on the GFA, I really don't know. I know that there's a lot of work going on to select the focus countries. And I know that there's a lot of hope for those to come out soon. I don't have the answer to that question. And it is with the administration right now. So I don't know if there's anybody on the call who,
I think Karine froze for a second, but I think she's giving any administration representative who wants to weigh in this forum, we welcome you. But assuming that's not the case, we will wait. I think Karine is still frozen, unfortunately. I know she's overseas and may have some internet problems. So I'll forge ahead, and then hopefully we'll be able to have Karine rejoin us in a minute. Kate and Lauren, do you still see me? Okay, great. Glad it's not on my end. Okay,
I apologize.
Corinne, I think you're
I'm
back.
having connections issues. I'm not in my regular workspace. So very quickly to get to your question, Francis, where I think I got cut off. Next steps for the GFA, really, because as I mentioned, I see that as the vehicle for carrying some of these lessons forward in the immediate, at least on the U.S. side. And I think the steps are really clear, as the questioner asked. First is the selection of the focus countries. Under the GFA, the U.S. government has to select a minimum of 5 countries under the GFA where it will focus its efforts and develop 10-year plans to address fragility in 3 countries where conflict is ongoing and at least 2 countries where there is not yet full-scale conflict, so where the efforts would be more preventive. So selection of those countries is critical. It was meant to happen, I believe, a year and a half ago, so we're obviously behind, but at the same time, we had a political transition here in the US, so it's understandable to some extent, but that's step number 1. Step number 2 is really start implementing those country plans, those 10-year country plans with funds that Congress is making available to the administration to do this. So critical as well. And then third, I'd say, the GFA, at the heart of the GFA is an experimental approach. And that's the reason for requiring the administration to focus on just a handful of countries where it can demonstrate that it can do things differently. I think Congress recognizes that this is a really difficult set of challenges. If we didn't get it right for 20 years in Afghanistan, it's unlikely we're going to get it right around the world, in the next 10, even 20 years. And I think that's really significant that Congress recognizes the challenge, the scope of the challenge, across all the issues that we've just discussed, and is willing to give the administration or, state and aid, mostly with DoD and other agencies, the benefit of the doubt to test out new approaches, to try something different, to take all of the lessons that we've all learned, but as various speakers have said on this panel, are just difficult to apply. We know we need to be doing conflict analysis differently, but are we doing it differently? And are we injecting it into the policy process? That's a different question. So Congress is really just wanting to see an attempt at a different approach, and then wanting to see the lessons from that attempt to take that forward. So I think Congress sees this as an iterative process going forward. And I really hope the administration takes that opportunity to heart. Because I get the feeling sometimes that, people in government feel a bit overwhelmed by what's being asked under this bill. But if they're able to see it as an opportunity to demonstrate a new approach, to test new approaches, I think it takes on a whole new different feel. And so I hope that policymakers are able to do that. Of course, the systems are not in place for doing nimble experimentation, but I think that's part of the process, to come back with a policy review and say, we had a 1-year time frame and we simply couldn't do the experimentation under that time frame. That would be a big step, to just come back and tell Congress that that's the lesson from the first year of trying to implement this. So anyway, so I think those are the 3 steps. Select the countries, move forward with the plans, and really focus on that experimentation process and the learning from it. And for that, you do need to have some systems in place to make sure that you're gathering the lessons learned along the way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Corinne. I want to solicit any additions from Kate and Lauren to that, but before I do that, I also want to share some questions we've gotten from the audience, which are terrific. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to summarize a grab bag of questions we've gotten from the audience, and then I'm going to turn to Kate, then Lauren, then Corinne to address 1 or 2 of these questions that you're well positioned to. So unfortunately, we don't have time for everyone to weigh in on every question because there's some really meaty ones. Audience, still keep those questions coming. And then the final thing I will say to Amanda Willett is that we are coming to the localization agenda as our final act. So there's that to look forward to. Thank you for your question. So here's the grab bag of questions, panelists. One, a really good question from Ada Sonnenfeld. Are there alternative approaches from other situations where development support is provided without explicit state building aims in the presence of a weak or illegitimate state, maybe starting with their smaller goals? Lessons on that. A question and a comment from Mohammed Asman Tariq mentioning that he's surprised that for 2 decades, there have been incompetent leadership on the host government side on Afghanistan for 2 decades, and that was also a factor. So I would say the focus here is us donors learning our own lessons, but I think you would probably get no argument from Afghanistan watchers on that. But if anybody wants to weigh in on that, great. A question from Malalai. Hello, Malalai. She'd like to hear some reflections on the current Afghanistan situation and the Women, Peace and Security Act, WPS. Unfortunately, we are seeing diplomatic delegations meeting with the Taliban, where women are excluded not only from the Afghan team, but also, she says, sadly, from Western delegations. And then a question from Melissa Lane, asking about Afghanistan's high level of dependence on foreign aid and how that reminds her of the situation in Haiti as well. Any research on how we can generate less dependence in foreign aid on our interventions, perhaps via developing human capital. And then finally, a question from Katrin on psychosocial factors of conflict dynamics and peace building, and reflections on that. So several questions. Kate, going to go to you first to pick off what you can do.
Okay, great questions. And I'm going to attempt to speak to Mohammed Osman Tariq's very good question about leadership in Afghanistan. And I mean, of course, it is very important. And I think I touched on it in my in talking about the current crisis and the failures and corruption of the last government, of the former government and others. But I wanted to say that I think there's emerging appreciation on the U.S. side for this fundamental dynamic that was at play in terms of the ways that we in the donor community tried to use conditionality to pressure the Hamid Karzai and then Ashraf Ghani governments to undertake reforms that were very important to us. At the end of the day, our strategy to succeed, to achieve U.S. objectives in Afghanistan always depended on the survival of their regimes. And they knew this. And that inherently undermined the tools for the leverage that we had at our disposal. We could not credibly threaten to withhold aid when they knew that we were so desperate for the continuation of their government. So a signal that we would be withholding aid is not credible unless the host nation government, feels that the donor will follow through on it, right? And we had these repeated conferences, pledging conferences, and then conferences to, for instance, for the Kabul process and many after, and Tokyo and so on, to kind of come up with a shared plan for the national development strategy for agreed reforms. However, I think in many cases, the threat of withholding aid, was just didn't have the force that we might have hoped it had, because the government knew we were so dependent on them. So, I think that sets up a dynamic where for the donors, we have to first identify that problem with our leverage, and be realistic about maybe the generational timeline that it will take to address like institutional deficiencies and to to work for institution building and better linkages between the subnational level and the national level. I think we were often just too insistent or too impatient to see progress in order to have the willingness to kind of move more slowly, or to perhaps withhold funds when we didn't see the actions the reforms we wanted to see by the host government.
Thanks, Kate. Really, really useful response to a super thorny question. Thank you, Mohammed, for raising. Lauren, over to you to tackle some of those.
I'll focus on one, and you'll have to remind me of the ask, but it's around what we've learned from other situations where we have a transitional government or where a government is not in place. In Afghanistan, of course, not recognized. And I will point to some ideas that would require further panels. But, I think in many situations where, we're dealing with de facto governments, the World Bank has been one of the first actors to come in through emergency operations. But we have a process in place where we institute our operational policy called 7.30 and just stop. I mean, things just stop. We freeze them because we have to take a pause. Now, Afghanistan is obviously a different case, but in many cases, we just had a coup in Burkina. Every day you can talk about the kind of, in these countries right now, especially the kind of decisions we're having to take in real time, where we're dealing with a de facto government and what we do with aid in that short to medium term. And I think there is a lot to learn from that decision making when we institute our own operational policies on working with de facto governments and the kind of decisions we take. And I'll tell you a few, but I can't get into the substance. But I think we can learn from what we do right now in African countries where we've been experiencing a coup, but for years in Yemen, where we've had to take strong decisions on how to engage with the United Nations in the absence of government. I think, for example, one of the key issues around the crisis for us in Afghanistan in terms of the economic crisis is also thinking about the role of the International Monetary Fund. And I don't think we talk about that enough as well. In Libya right now, in Yemen, we're also trying to understand the role of the central bank and the role that those multiple central banks, frankly, because they often have more than one when you're dealing with a divided territory, play in developing the economic solutions. In Libya, for example, we're discussing how we can engage in the economic dialogue. And that economic dialogue has a lot to do with thinking about how we influence a discussion around transparency, including financial transparency. In Somalia, for example, where we've been working also for years, where we've been working in parts of Somalia with trust funds. And trust funds allow us especially to engage actors like the private sector or NGOs or groups in ways that we can engender demand-driven growth for greater transparency and accountability, and to really sort of edge into issues around the social contract, so the bottom up. And so it takes different instruments. The instrument that we've been using in Afghanistan is the multi-donor trust fund. So that's an instrument where we can also have another panel on around the politics around multi-donor trust funds and what that means in terms of releasing or talking about the use of aid in situations like the crisis in Afghanistan today, having used that multi-donor trust fund for years, which engendered fast disbursement, efficient disbursement for our technical programs. And so is that instrument fit for purpose, particularly in fragile situations? And we could have a discussion about multi-donor trust funds. Two more examples are, really working into the peace settlements and lessons from Mali, in northern Mali, where I think we have worked with, again, situations where we are helping to discuss the most developmentally effective short-term interventions vis-a-vis a peace settlement that may then switch the bargain. So maybe it's not large infra, maybe it's working on access to justice, because that is going to help to engender a more stable and sustainable peace process. So I think there are a lot of examples. I'm just thinking through all these: Yemen, Myanmar, Mali, Libya right now. I mean, the list goes on. It's an amazing question. So I'll turn it back over to you, Francis. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, so much there. Karine, over to you to tackle the grab bag.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll take Melissa Lane's question because it's an important one, and we need to unpack it a little bit. So her question was about, in all of the reports and recommendations that we've talked about, what do they have to say about dependency on foreign assistance, and what can be done in these contexts to decrease dependency on foreign aid. And I think, I think some of what we've said, it's been implicit in some of what we said, but it's really important for donors to be thinking about how to build capacity in the governments that they're working with, and how to build local capacity as well. That is definitely something that's in the law, the GFA. Obviously, again, what gets implemented is a different issue, but the GFA does focus quite a bit on country ownership and on ensuring that the objectives, the reforms that donors are supporting are actually those of the citizens. So that's critical. Obviously the World Bank does this for a living, building the capacity, so the IMF does as well. But building capacity beyond just kind of in the finance ministries and looking at other aspects of governance I would say for the US in particular, in the security sector, building that sustained capacity, that's a whole other discussion that we probably can't have now, but at least prioritizing that as part of the efforts in the GFA and the lessons learned. And then I would say, and I know we're going to get to that, so I'm not going to say too much, but building the capacity of the local organizations is something that USAID is thinking about right now with the localization agenda, but that we also need to be thinking about when we're delivering this aid in conflict-affected countries, even the most conflict-affected ones, like the ones that Melissa mentions, Haiti and Afghanistan. And I don't mean to exclude also building the capacity of local governments. So at the national government level, at the local government level, and civil.
We may have lost Karine again.
And one that's not very difficult to that's not very easy to operationalize. So everything, is going to depend on whether those recommendations the efforts are made to operationalize those recommendations.
Francis, could I just add 2 words to that, which is debt management? I think everything Karine said is true, but we've got the COVID crisis for 2 years on top of conflict. Okay, and then also in some of these countries, horrendous disasters. And I think, the bank has put debt management front and center. I think we have to talk about debt management if we're going to talk about foreign aid dependency as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Well taken. Okay, so this segues perfectly into the final thing that we want to discuss, which is aid localization. When I think about Melissa's question on dependency, when I think about Ada's question on alternative approaches, and then when I see Amanda Willett's question on the localization agenda, I think that really ties into this, our discussion here about how do we chart a different way forward. So Amanda's question is, as USAID is internally reflecting on ongoing procurement reform, how can it continue to advance broadening the base of partners and specifically drive forward Administrator Power's ambitious localization agenda and targets? And then she's got questions on expanding timelines for USAID country plans and staff tenure contribute to long-term thinking. So there's a lot there, and we regrettably have a short time to follow up. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to turn to each of the panelists in turn once again, ask them to weigh in on the localization agenda moving forward, either related to the bank in Lauren's case or US government. Ambassador Power is not the first USAID administrator who has actually tried to advance a localization agenda. So what's possible, what can be done, lessons learned. So I'd like you to each turn to some reflections on the localization agenda, and additionally, any final remarks, any other things you've thought of during this conversation, because we are unfortunately 7 minutes from wrapping up. So I'm going to turn to Kate, then Lauren, then Karine to conclude. And Kate, over to you, localization and any other thoughts.
Sure, thanks. Localization, I want to add one point into this mix, and that is our posture of our diplomats and aid workers in these contexts. I think when you have an embassy staff that is not able to leave the compound hardly ever and do good old-fashioned like diplomatic engagement and reporting, then how can you have any effective localized response? We became too. This is a much larger debate, of course, and security and force protection is not my expertise. But at least I think there is a willingness on the part of diplomats and aid workers to be more tolerant of risk, and I hope that institutionally we can evolve to respond to that. So I think that's one important piece of localization. And then more broadly, just takeaways from the whole conversation. And I think for Afghanistan going forward, one of the most difficult things will be to figure out how do we engage the Taliban without legitimating them, and we'll have to accept that this humanitarian aid, it is to some extent enabling them. I mean, it's enabling them to put their own revenue in other places, and yet we have to make a choice. It's a terrible choice, but I think we should be committed to the Afghan people first, and do what we can to prevent a catastrophic loss of life, and also engagement with the Taliban is an avenue to greater leverage, hopefully, with them. Isolation is probably not going to lead to more ability to exert leverage. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kate, for all of your remarks. And I will just add that Kate has kindly shared a couple of resources in the group chat on Katrine's question on psychosocial support, as well as what could be done in Afghanistan. So check out the group chat for more. Lauren, over to you. Reflections on localization and any final thoughts.
Okay, great. 3 points on localization. One is emphasizing duty of care. I think it's one thing to say localization, it's another thing to revisit our own duty of care policies in our agencies and institutions. We lost hundreds of people working on the NSP and Citizen Charter program over 20 years. And I don't think we've had a strong enough discussion about what it means to localize, when indeed what that means also there's a loss of lives. And I think that has to be front and center to the localization agenda. The other one is decentralization of staff. The bank has done a bit of that. We've decentralized staff with a lot of incentives to be placed in, to work in these countries directly. The question that we've raised in evaluation is what kind of staff? I think there was a lot of emphasis on the ability for staff to be able to bring technical know-how to countries that are least developed and often in conflict. But do these same staff have the kind of conflict sensitivities and understand how to integrate some of those political analyses into their work on a daily basis? So, it's a real sort of a real superstar you're looking for here, someone with all the technical know-how in a sector, whether it's water or education, and also have all that conflict awareness. And so that's a different cadre, I think, of folks. And we have to think about what that means to be staffing up that way. And Leslie, I'd say there's a lot of work that the bank has done, and this is from our folks in our community-driven development area that have written a lot on what it means to do community-driven development in conflict-affected areas, and a lot of learning there. And I think that's something we could also utilize all the evaluations around community-driven development in conflict-affected areas to support the localization agenda and learn from that. Those are my 3 points. And I don't have a sum statement, but I will thank you very much, Frances, for inviting me and for putting the work out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And yes, to Lauren's point, the bank has researched a ton on community-driven development the world over in its work. I happen to use this book all the time and highly recommend it. So yes, there's a lot to be learned on localization at every level. Karine, over to you. Reflections on localization, way forward, and then any final words.
Sure. So on localization, as Frances said, this is not a new agenda at USAID. We've seen USAID Forward. We've had the Journey to Self-Reliance, both of which emphasized localization. And not a whole lot of progress has been made. We have to be frank. That said, I am very hopeful that Ambassador Power has taken up this cause. She's very tenacious. And I figure if anyone can make a difference on this, maybe she can. So I think, there's a lot that's required for USAID to work more closely with local organizations. It requires more resources. It requires more staff at the local level to work more closely with these organizations. There are obviously more of them. They need more support. So it's a big endeavor. It's going to require lots of reforms of the regulatory burdens that USAID imposes on all of its partners and which local organizations just can't navigate. But as I said, Ambassador Power has really committed to tackling these issues. I think one solution that is being discussed is whether USAID foreign service nationals, so the staff that are hired in the countries, which frankly have a huge role, and I think are really important if we want to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US government, for them to be able to take on contracting responsibilities is potentially a solution that USAID is exploring. Now, I think, and this is maybe my final point, is the localization agenda, as we all know, is critical for peace building. But to what extent is USAID going to focus on peace building environments and fragile environments? Or, is localization really going to happen more in the Ghanas and the more stable situations where it's easier to work with the local partners? So that's an important question. It's going to take real focus. And I would say the same for evidence-based policy. There's an effort to really focus on evidence-based policy at USAID right now, which is fantastic. And I think Ambassador Powers hired or is hiring somebody at a very senior level to promote, economic analysis and into USAID policy and practices. But to what extent is conflict and conflict analysis going to be a part of that? Still, I think unclear. And I very much hope that it's part of the equation and that it's a big focus at the agency. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Karine. And I really appreciated all the comments today. I think I came away from this conversation even more convinced of the need to do things differently, and myself having generated or received some new ideas on how to do it. I think none of us have any illusions of how hard some of the bureaucratics are, but I hope this conversation can be the beginning of some forward movement. I agree with Karine's points. We've got leadership at USAID from the U.S. government side who's intent on pushing progress, and that bodes well. So we will stay tuned on all these issues. Thank you to our terrific panelists. Thank you to terrific participants and audience for all your questions. And I look forward to continuing the conversation, hopefully in the future. Bye-bye, everybody.